Fantastic, Jerich. Nice to see you. I look forward to having this conversation.
Likewise, I've been looking forward to this one for a while, ever since we had our short chat on the phone a couple of weeks ago. And, I would not do you justice if I tried to share your background with everyone. So please take a moment and share your career journey with the audience.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the cyber arena for close to 3 decades now, so I'm probably aging myself. Early 90s, I was an undergraduate student at John Jay College Criminal Justice in the great city of New York, researching the intersection of criminal behavior and the use of technology. That propelled my career into more of a security engineer and network defender, deploying infrastructure and data centers for the New York Wall Street financial services area up until about the early 2000s. Spent about just over a decade in the financial services and banking arena. I was the global CISO for GE Capital when we were a $500 billion financial institution across 60 countries, roughly 120,000 employees. I always joke, as a global CISO for a complex organization, that's where I lost all of my hair. And spent a couple of years in the, I can see, Jerich, you've got that appreciation as well. Yep, we've got the same haircut. We go to the same barber. Spent a couple of years in the, what I call the management consulting business. Stood up a small practice for Ernst & Young's financial services business. And that's really when I started to kind of pivot the cyber discussion to enterprise risk, investment, type of exposure, as well as having a more articulated conversation with the quote unquote non-technical persona in the enterprise. And spent that led me to an opportunity to go serve at the Securities Exchange Commission chair's office. So I worked under Chair White and Chair Clayton for 4 years, leading all things cyber for the SEC, but also informing how we think about systemic risk across the financial markets within the U.S. Treasury, working very closely with the intelligence community, as well as the balance of the regulators in terms of how we think about prioritizing and overseeing cyber risk at the kind of board level, the enterprise risk level, with a kind of focus on financial services, and help to inform some of our policies and our thinking around cyber risk governance within the publicly listed company sphere within the SEC. It's about 5,000-ish publicly listed companies within the SEC. The SEC also has oversight across the quote unquote, underbelly of the securities market. So we think about the large scale exchanges, clearinghouse functions, broker dealers, investment advisors. And we stood up a 2018 interpretive guidance around cyber risk oversight. And that kind of set the stage around what it means to articulate cyber to business, operational, financial outcomes. And fast forward 3 years later, out of government, now kind of operating in the the enterprise risk in the boardroom arena as a senior advisor across the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors. We've got about 23,000 corporate directors in our portfolio, and our mission is to drive education around cyber, what cyber mean to enterprise risk, and to be an effective board member. And then lastly, we're starting to pivot more, what I would call financially oriented analytics into the boardroom, so that the board member has a full, complete picture in terms of how cyber can manifest itself within that particular company, and what would be the outcomes, so that we're having more of a business-oriented language. So it's been quite the journey for the last 30 years. At the ripe age of 50, I never knew I'd be kind of operating at this level, but we see this as a systemic risk area that needs to be treated at top of the house, and we need more soldiers like yourself, Jerich, to be out there leaning into the CISO community, so that we're more articulate and more prepared to meet these heightened expectations. So look forward to the conversation.
Dude, that background, once again, I would have not done you justice, but I have to say we are doing a really bad job of advertising for anyone that has hair that wants to join in the cyber community, because we're showing them, if done right, this is what you look like at the end.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you once again. And before we start, I want to once again just say thank you. I'm honored that you took the time to have this conversation. Like, seriously, thank you. Okay, so this is going to be a special episode, and I don't know if anyone is more qualified to answer the first question, right? So on March 9th, 2022, the SEC released the new SEC proposed rules on cybersecurity risk management, strategy, governance, incident disclosure for public companies. For the uninitiated, can you please give a high-level overview of what that proposed guidance was, and then share what CISOs should be doing to prepare?
Yeah, so as mentioned before, Jerich, we set the stage or planted the seed in 2018 when we issued an interpretive guidance around cyber risk disclosure. Two of the main points that we pivoted towards within those guiding principles was around making a distinction between a cyber incident or event versus a cyber risk, and it's important to make that distinction. It's analogous to going to the cardiologist, and they do a cardiological workup. The doctor says, hey, you've got 80% clogging of your artery, and you've got a risk that needs to be addressed. And so we want to be transparent about that risk, and what's the treatment method in order to reduce that risk. So that's an area that companies need to be thoughtful of, particularly the CISO, as it's integrated into the enterprise risk. What's our risk exposure? how will these risks being treated? Could they potentially manifest itself into, again, using the cardiologist analogy, a quote unquote heart attack, right? Could this risk exposure translate into unnecessary, unintended consequences for a cyber adversary to come in and compromise our network? Or it could be just poor hygiene that causes an employee to inflict erroneous code without having the right checks and balances. Suddenly, boom, you're out for 24 hours because of an unnecessary outage. And then the second piece is what we all call an incident or an event. Obviously, the analogy, I guess, it's right of boom. You got left of boom, right of boom. Incident happens, and you're required to understand, dimension what that incident means to your business, your operation, and your exposure, and prepare some type of disclosure and have some protocols in place to figure out how to address that risk, how to communicate it upstream to the enterprise risk organization, whether it be the general counsel, the CFO, the chief risk officer, the board of directors, the regulators. In some cases, there's a requirement to, particularly in the financial services and banking space, you've got to have that hardwire on, ready to call the Fed, the OCC, the FDIC, alphabet soup. And so those underlying requirements within the SEC guidance was baked into those core principles within 2018. Fast forward, 3.5, 4 years later, the new chair, Gensler, has a fairly aggressive agenda as it pertains to cyber risk. They see this as a systemic issue to our national security. They see this as a systemic issue to our economy. Those two are intertwined. Without a strong, healthy economy, that degrades our ability to fund certain efforts and maintain proper national security. So there's a realization that we need to do a better job in terms of understanding the relationship between those two lenses on cyber as a traditional technical issue and a financial issue. And just, high level, it's really taking what we established in 2018 and advanced principles around, thinking about like cyber as it pertains to governing as part of enterprise risk. There's additional language in there that talks about the boardroom requirements. So, be articulate in the board. Do you have the right level of board level expertise? Is it somebody dedicated that's a former CISO, former CIO? We see some board members that are former CEOs of cybersecurity companies. They spent 30 years running a cyber company. They're proficient at delivering product and services, solving for problems. So they're quote unquote the cyber expert. And then the other lens to that is, can you create a subcommittee, which we're actually seeing more of a trend where it's a subcommittee, let's say, of the risk committee of the board that focuses on cybersecurity, including other similar risk domains like geopolitical risk, supply chain risk. You might have some climate risk components there, or physical security. And then it becomes more of a blended committee of experts that you can basically just outsource to. So there are a bunch of firms that, you hire them on retainer. They drop in, the experts on a quarterly basis, and they kind of sit side by side with the board members. So that's another dimension to it. The other piece is, how do we think about cyber as it pertains to the business, operational, financial exposure, and how does that drive the significance of both risks and incidents to your business? For reporting, I guess the technical legal term is materiality. It's what I call the so what factor, right? When I was a CISO, we had thousands of incidents on a daily basis. How do you sort through that compilation of incidents and identify those nuggets that are really going to take down your business? And then the other piece is around incident reporting, which is still kind of working its way through the review process. It's not a lock. It's not guaranteed yet, but there's an expectation, at least the way that the rule is proposed, that within 4 days of the determination that the incident is material, that could, material determination, we can get into this, can be 24 hours, it could be 12 months, right? So it's a broad spectrum, but there's an expectation that you disclose. So those are kind of the main mountaintops of the current rule as it stands.
Okay.
And happy to dive into any questions as you have.
Yeah, those. First, I'm happy to hear that there's still work to be done on the incident side of things, because definition of an incident, from what I read, was really vague, and any data was potentially in scope. And one of the things that I know we do today in most organizations is we look at the materiality of the data, right? Is it sensitive data? Is it not sensitive data? Because if they stole the fantasy football data, we don't have to report on it, right? But the way it's written, any data on any registrant's information system, I think was the terminology used, is reportable. So I won't dig in too deep on that because that's still in the works. I'm curious about, one, what do you think CISO should do to prepare, or if there's anything we should do to prepare? And two, you talked about former CEOs sitting on boards now of security companies and so forth. In the financial world, when Sarbanes-Oxley first came about, SECs, man, they changing things, right? But when the financial reporting requirements came out and financial expertise was required, there was a clear baseline for what you needed to be able to do. You need to understand GAAP principles. You needed to have some history in financial reporting. You need to understand internal controls. It was very clear. This is what makes you an expert. I didn't see that guidance for what makes someone a cyber expert. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and it's a loaded point. What is quote unquote a cyber expert? And as you know, in the cybersecurity arena, we all are born through specific backgrounds. Some of us were just pure technologists. Some of us came from the compliance end of the spectrum. Some of us, like myself, came from the network engineering, aspect of cyber. So, I was building data centers, deploying, thousands of firewalls and network detection systems, and then eventually, pivoted into traditional management and executive roles within banking. And so you got to think about, that trajectory, and, my view on this, and actually it's beyond my view, our view within the National Association of Corporate Directors, as you think about cyber expertise and competency in the board, we think of it as, yes, an individual, if you were to dedicate a board seat to that quote unquote cyber technology expert, the individual should have experience running and operating a fairly complex organization, obviously have a team of individuals reporting to them, have budget challenges. We'd like to see individuals that can appreciate the intensity with various types of incidents, what we call putting out cyber fires, again, hair loss, taking calls at midnight, on the weekends and the holidays, building that scar tissue on incident response. Given the focus on the litigation aspect of cyber and the compliance implications, which can be very costly, and I've seen companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars in response to cyber events that were just pure legal costs. So having that compliance engagement with external stakeholders, regulators, shareholders, that's an important blend as part of the ingredients to be that effective board member with that cyber background. But beyond just the technical piece, what about managing human capital? What about overseeing strategy for a company? What about an appreciation for how a company goes to market, how it leans in to maximize profit? I always say it's all about the Benjamins, right? We're if you're in a corporate setting that's designed for growth, you've got to understand what's that growth engine. How do you differentiate yourself between the competitors? What regions do we have to expand into? So there's that, growth engine component of being effective in the board seat. and then flipping the script on it. Hey, so based on that growth trajectory, how to preserve that capital growth, and how can cyber introduce an impediment to that strategic growth? So that's where you've got to be multidimensional, multifaceted, and look, having a degree, of diverse thinking and diverse minds and diverse backgrounds. I mean, I sit on the board of Society Hispanic Professional Engineers. As a proud Puerto Rican from the Bronx, I bring a different perspective compared to, other folks of other cultures and other backgrounds that sit on a potential board. So I think that it's an ingredients of multiple dimensions to be effective, and that's exactly what the NACD community is looking for. We're not looking to necessarily drop in a 15 year CISO or cybersecurity operations individual into the board and expect them to be effective. You've got to have that rounded out perspective and view, and that's where I think we're trying to address what's the trajectory path. How can we advance our executive competency within the cybersecurity community to be more effective at the board level?
Yeah, what you just told me is we have a shortage of qualified people to sit on those board seats right now.
It's slim pickings, man.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so put yourself in the CISO seat. You hear this guidance has just dropped. It's not official yet, but it's definitely potentially coming. The SEC, once again, they went back to Sarbanes-Oxley. They are changing things when it comes to security. In many ways, I believe Sarbanes-Oxley was the beginning of security in the public sector. The government was already doing it, in the private sector, right? And the government was already doing it, but not necessarily, in publicly traded companies. So this guidance, let's just say it's going to happen. What should a CISO be doing? One or two things they should be considering doing to prepare for this, so it doesn't really hit them flat-footed.
Yeah. So the starting point, and I've had several conversations with the SEC, the current chair, and I've got staff in place that I hired that are actively working on this rulemaking process, and they're trying to add value and really put this in perspective. So my hat's off to the quote unquote cyber experts within the SEC that are working hand in hand with the rulemakers on this topic. But a couple things. One is really think hard about your incident management process. And I've had conversations with CISOs and incident reporting teams within organizations, all the way through the vendors that are delivering product that give you insights into network telemetry, right? And security operations type of tools. So really think hard about your visibility into your core IT estate, the relative risk exposure across that IT estate to business processes, specific data sets, and start to run some analysis to see where you have pockets of exposure that are going to be, again, I'll use the technical term, material to your business. It's, to your point, you might have fantasy football data on your network. If it's released, okay, so maybe you have an advantage on me if we're competing in fantasy football, right? But it's not going to take down my enterprise.
Right.
But if you're a big pharma company and you've got some secret ingredients that's going to advance the next, cancer curing drug, and you're saying, hey, your analysis asserts that this R&D, this data is going to increase our market share by 30%. And, it's going to have benefit downstream effects to our market. If that data is compromised, that's a so what factor. That's a factor that can have a material effect to our business. So having that analysis done on point, that foundation in terms of data governance, who owns the data, who's right sizing the importance of that data and the underlying systems. Then if you're sitting on top of that, monitoring for the various fires, right, to occur in a incident management role, and that could be the IR team, it could be the security operations center, I'd make sure that those folks in those organizations, and let's face it, the security operations center on average, you're loading up with dashboards and tools. Some folks are experienced, some folks are college. We don't expect those individuals to be fluent in terms of how a security incident is going to negatively impact your business. So enrich those security operations centers and those incident response teams with as much data and analytics to translate when those incidents occur. How do you prioritize? How do you sort through the thousands of incidents to make sure that it's elevated in an efficient way so that you could start performing that analysis, right? In terms of what's material, what's not for reporting. So that's one that's one foundational piece. The second is in terms of your overall engagement with the boardroom. And even before it gets to the board, think about the enterprise risk management team. So finance, compliance, risk, HR. How do you bring business, operational, and financial context to that team? And how does that get delivered into the board where you're pairing? And this is what we actually released through the NACD more recently. What's the overall financial, operational, business exposure to the organization as I sit that are related to cyber risks and potential attacks, a view across that cyber threat landscape that are going to cause the most material, operational, financial loss to our business. And then as part of that analysis and that report upstream to the board is gaining insights in terms of how effectively I'm deploying resources, controls, capital to effectively mitigate that financial loss. And that's exactly what the SEC wants to see. He wants to stop with the technical delivery of cyber risk into the boardroom. That has no relevance on your business. It's relationship between those cyber exposures, those defenses, to mitigating financial operational loss, and how does that drive business resiliency. So I'd really focus in on those two facets. And if you're not there, and I've seen many CISOs that hire a big four, pick the firm to do a NIST technical oriented assessment. They bring it to their CEO before it makes its way to the audit committee, and they say, stop. We want to deliver business context. We want to understand how effective our cybersecurity program it is to maintaining business resilience and reducing cyber exposure, reducing financial exposure.
That's really helpful, and I think it's a perfect segue into the next thing I want to talk to you about. I like that you use the word resilience. So let's move away from what the SEC is asking for and put more of your NACD hat on. And we've actually referenced their guidance multiple times on previous shows. But from your experience using that CEO wanting business context, as an example, what do boards actually want? And what do they actually need to know? Or are they even one and the same? Do they want what they need? I'm curious what your thoughts are here.
Well, just to be fully transparent with the boardroom community, I've been operating as an advisor to the NACD for just about 3.5 years. And while at the SEC, we ran a wide range of engagements with the NACD to get the boardroom perspective to inform some of our rulemaking process. I would say on average, we run surveys on an annual basis. On average, it's between 65 to 75% of the boardroom community that still assert that they're not comfortable with the state of the cybersecurity program. They don't understand the metrics that are being delivered. They don't understand the relationship between the deployment of capital to the reduction of risk. They're not comfortable with their management team's ability to defend the enterprise, and I've seen this just sitting in the dozens of board meetings as an observer and advisor, objectively. So I've seen the disconnect. So and the board does not want a highly technical report out in terms of the cyber posture. Yes, they want to know where the threats are going to manifest. How effective we are in terms of defending. And if we have that quote unquote cyber expert on the board, we can have a sidebar discussion to really dive into the operational metrics. But that's really not designed for the entirety of the board or even some of these audit committees or risk committees that are focused on health. So what the board is seeking to deliver going forward is the conversion of a traditional highly technical cyber risk report to something that's easily understood, aligned to business metrics to effectively support their oversight role and to achieve proper governance. And proper governance is really about a materiality analysis to support what's our current posture, what's our future exposures. And now, instead of having that one individual speaking to the CISO, having that technical one-on-one discussion, I now have the entirety of the board engaged, collaborating and thinking about more holistically, what's important to our business in order to drive risk mitigation. I'd say some another insights from the boardroom. They're always interested in how are our peers performing, how are they deploying capital and resources, what are they realizing in terms of regulatory exposure. They're always interested in trend analysis. So, based on, last 12, 18 months, we gave the CISO $100 million in budget. How is that reducing our business exposure? How is that reducing our financial exposure? Should we be shifting those dollars elsewhere, paired with some of our strategic objectives as a company? And then, on a quarterly basis, ideally, you should be seeing the relationship between the deployment of that capital and resource and the reduction in cyber risk. Now, we all know the conditions in obviously the wild change on a daily basis, on a minute by minute basis, arguably.
Yeah, they do.
But the business is fairly static. But there's also dynamics to the business, and some businesses may decide to acquire another company. Some may decide to divest. Some companies, don't know why, might decide to outsource some of their technology or operations to mainland China. So all these dynamics, right, converts on the business and impacts your cyber exposure. So you got to be able to ebb and flow and flex based on those business conditions and how that material impacts your exposure and how that's articulated to the board. So if we can get to that level, and I've seen some companies take a swing at it and start to be effective, but we have a long way to go.
Yeah, we do. And, we like our frameworks in security, and there's not really a framework out there that maps specifically to business, because to your point, every business is different. The dynamics of every business is different. So we don't have a NIST CSF that we can, lean on to have those types of conversations. And that is why CISOs need to be business savvy. They need to understand their organizations so they can speak the business. We talk about speaking the business all the time, but it's completely different when you're providing everything technical in business context, including outcomes, financial impacts. So thank you for that. And something you said, I want to hone in on a little bit more. And I guess maybe going back to my experiences, in my travels, I've heard statements like, we don't need to outrun the bear. We just need to outrun our peers, right? And that statement in many ways is the impetus for the benchmark-based strategies that you were in consulting. You've seen them often. And executives want to know what their industry peers are doing, like you said, even from a regulatory standpoint, from a financial and investment standpoint. And that drives strategic decisions and definitely investment. When you advise boards, does your guidance change based on those types of factors? Industry, peers, organizational size, even age of organizations, or is it pretty static?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, when I was a CISO at GE Capital, we were SIFI designation, so significantly important financial institution as per Dodd-Frank. And we historically had very limited regulation. Our budget comparison to our peers was, say, a good 5 to 6 percentage points lower. So I had to bring forth to my friends in Wall Street, say, here's what our peers are doing. And they're we're at 2-3% of IT budget. They're at 10%. And here's where they're deploying all their resources. And so that type of data is critical because I presented that to my board, to our executive team. Say, here's where we are, and here's where our peers are, and
Same.
our regulators, namely the Fed, is going to look at that difference. And if we don't have a compelling story to demonstrate that we're elevating our game, they're going to force us to do it. So you never want to be in a position where you're forced to spend. You want to be in the driver's seat and be proactive. And the same applies to many of the boards that we engage with, many of the corporations, all shapes and sizes. Jerich, it could be, a mid-market manufacturer compared to a hospital, compared to a regional bank. And each one of those companies have different risk profiles, different regulatory pressures, different revenue objectives, and different cyber threat objectives. And so what we try to do is right size the deployment of resources, capital, and reporting of cyber risk to that business profile, and think that through delivering an insightful analytics capability that we identified through the risk transfer market. So 4 years out of government, my first role out of government was in the cyber insurance industry. And you're probably asking, Chris, why would you go work for an insurance company? Well, it was fascinating. And some of it was intellectual curiosity, but it's fascinating how the risk transfer markets are applying actuarial data sets and models based on historical losses and using forensics accounting, almost like deconstructing the balance sheet to figure out where those cyber threats would manifest based on your specific business profile. And then you can back into that, here are the top threats that are going to cause financial harm, and here are the top mitigation areas that we should really deploy using more of a fiscal strategy versus, hey, we're just going to throw MFA 80% across our network. Yeah, that's a basic, that's a foundation. That's almost like saying, hey, in order to navigate the room, I need to put the light on because I need to understand where I'm walking. So those foundational steps are critical. So we try to right size the company's cyber profile, investment spend, and the level of rigor, the level of deployment of resources based on that risk profile, because not all companies are treated equal. But rest assured, as you know, there are foundational components, basic blocking and tackling, basic hygiene that is non-negotiable.
Right.
That needs to be the foundation. So.
No, that's helpful and insightful as well. I like knowing that there's a baseline. And I asked that question somewhat selfishly, right? There are small organizations that I do business with, and I'm hoping that their guidance is similar to my guidance. Now, depending on my risk landscape, my threat landscape, the types of attacks, and so forth, we may have to do above and beyond that. But I was hoping that there was a baseline, and it sounds like there is. All right, so let's go a little bit deeper here, maybe a little bit more practical. Boards of directors come to you to help them make sense of this new world of cyber threats and, more importantly, their oversight of cyber. And part of our role as CISOs is to educate the board, answer some questions, and sometimes some very basic questions. So I know what I've seen in boardrooms and with the types of questions that I get asked, but as someone that is advising the board, I'm curious what type of questions they're asking you about what they should be asking us.
Yes, that's a great question. So it's a few areas, and we've tried to align our financial insights reporting to what's being asked for by the boards of CISOs. And it's not just the CISO, to be honest with you. It's also what I would call management as a whole, because it could be, culturally, you could have, the CISO runs point day to day on protecting, blocking, and tackling the enterprise. But as you know, the risk invariably sits within the business,
right,
or within the IT organization, or within the supply chain. And so the boards want, number one, to make sure that cyber is embedded as part of the fabric, as part of the culture. So it's more broad. It's not just we're going to beat up on the CISO. It's let's talk to the supply chain folks. Let's talk to the compliance organization. How well is this threaded across the enterprise? They also want to know where the organization's financial exposures are relative to expected losses. So we're particularly, this is more relevant now, and it's going to be more relevant once the SEC finalizes the rule this fall. Based on my company profile, right? So let's say I'm a $11 billion company. I operate in 30 countries. I've got a couple of billion records. What's my employee count? Let's say I have 30,000 employees, whatever it may be. Firmographically, as a company, where are those cyber threats going to manifest in terms of potential losses? And this is getting back to the insurance markets, where a cyber loss is really no different than another peril category within another risk domain, such as automobile accidents or flood, fire. Where are we deploying the fire suppressors? Where do we have the detection measures to make sure that when the smoke occurs, that we immediately suppress? What's the driving record around our company around phishing attempts, and how effective are we in terms of mitigating that risk? And so really it's about what's our overall financial exposure to cyber risk and attacks that have occurred or potentially will occur. One example would be, hey, we see some boards that have a report out. You're a couple $1 billion company. You've got potential for $200 million in unaddressed cyber risk, and it can manifest across these areas: IP theft, data breach, just to give you an example, payment fraud, ransomware is always called out separately, interruption of services or denial of service oriented interruption. So you want to quickly get to, here are the top 5 or top 10 areas that can lead to financial loss. And then quickly pivot based on our budget, based on how we got this deployed. Here's where we think we should deploy our defenses in a prioritized way to reduce that financial exposure. So again, it's the relationship between our business profile, where we have expected loss based on certain threat factors and certain risk factors. Where are those losses going to manifest? And then how are we deploying resources and capital to reduce that financial exposure? At the end of the day, that's really what the board needs to know. And then you gain insights in terms of, okay, so based on our overall risk, how do we optimize our risk transfer strategy? How do we stress our policies, our incident response plans across a wide range of potential incidents? And how do we deploy capital in an effective way that's going to reduce that risk? And look, you're not going to eliminate all risk.
Right.
If you're $4 trillion company, you're a global bank, you've got 300,000 employees, there's going to be some level of cyber risk that you got to accept. Yeah. So what's that number? And then getting back to your point on Sarbanes-Oxley, some of the GAAP principles, accounting, how does that top line risk exposure, and this is where the CISOs need to start working with their CFO and their general counsel, what percentage of that top line risk is relative to your revenue? So usually we're looking at a range between like 1% to 3% of revenue relative to your cyber risk exposure. And that helps to dictate what's disclosable from an SEC reporting perspective. And the boards are starting to knock on the door to figure out how companies are performing that analysis. I've seen it successfully deployed using advanced analytics born through the cyber risk transfer markets. And that's why the NACD has advanced the analytics platform to deliver insights and a more of a cyber risk reporting service to the boardroom community.
Yeah, it sounds also like a advertisement for the FAIR model as well. A lot of our risks are qualitative and not quantitative. And it sounds like we're going to be moving more and more towards that. We'll be forced to. because the board is going to demand that level of detail.
Yeah, I would say it's more of a quantitative approach to cyber that is using actuarial data sets and analysis born through the risk transfer markets. Because at the end of the day, the risk transfer markets is the arbiter for cyber risk. FAIR is not contemplated in cyber insurance, but conceptually, right? Yeah, it's academic, but it's the delivery of the insights in terms of where the losses occur based on historical losses to inform where to deploy the seatbelts, where to deploy the safety measures. No different than how the insurance markets are solving for safety measures around automobile, fire, flood. And you've got to contemplate a wide range of costs, whether it's due to a business interruption, a decrease in productivity, a delay in product losses, payments made based on ransom, extortion demands, what are the remediation costs of stolen assets, or realize what's the increased cybersecurity protection, what are the lost revenues from intellectual property theft, what are the litigation legal risks, are you seeing attrition in terms of customers? Those cost factors are not contemplated or not born through FAIR, not born through the IT organization. I don't know about you, but my degree is in computer science and information security. I'm not a forensics accountant or an actuary.
Not at all.
So allow the actuaries to figure this out. And what I would advise the CISO community is trust that the risk transfer markets are solving for this. It's no different than, hey, Jerich and I, let's go build an iPhone from scratch. Why would I do that if I can just buy this thing and trust that the coding and the platform, this thing works? So instead of having that top up, bottom down, over engineer process, let's allow the professionals to figure this out and then work collectively with that risk transfer community to make sure that we're aligning our defenses and we've got visibility into where the risks are.
I think that's a perfect close to the show, and I've taken up more of your time than I intended to. So I appreciate you sticking around for hours, man. My favorite part of the show is when we talk about metaphors or stories or analogies that we use to communicate a very technical topic to a non-technical audience. I think that's how we break communication barriers in many cases. The last episode we talked about dental hygiene and how that's compared to cyber hygiene, and it was so simple but so obvious, and I've used it already since then. I'm curious if there's any. You used the cardiologist example. I think that was perfect. I've already added that to my toolbox, but I'm curious if there are any others that you want to share.
Yeah, look, I think in this world of we need to bring cyber context, to the board, and business context and financial exposure. The purpose behind the quantification of the exposure is really not intended to provide an overall score. It's provided insights in terms of how to treat that risk. So again, it's analogous to going to the cardiologist. The cardiologist says, yes, your left artery is 80% blocked. And they say, we'll see you in a year. That's quantifying the exposure. No, let's treat the exposure. Let's identify where to solve for that clogged artery and what to do to mitigate. Well, stop eating McDonald's every day. Stop smoking. Lose 50 pounds. Get on the treadmill. And here's some medication that we can use to reduce that that plaque in your artery. And I'm going to see you in 3 months. And that's analogous to the check-in with the board. I'm going to see you every quarter, every 3 months, to make sure that we're taking risk, we're de-risking the organization, and we're treating the risk in such a way that is no different than we're treating a patient. Or to your analogy, it's proper dental hygiene, so I can avoid the plaque in my teeth or the potential root canal down the road.
I love it. And the best part is all of the mitigations are things that are fairly easy to do, but they require more work, and they are completely opposite of what we want to do, right? I love it. Chris, thank you. I knew this was going to be a wealth of information and a deluge for everybody that's kind of on watching and taking notes, and maybe people will have to go back. I learned so much. I'm going to have to rewatch this a few different times because some of those board insights were pure gold. Thank you for joining the show. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Jerich. Take care.
You too. Take care.